Welcome to part two of our story about deaf education in America. Our story started off with the American Asylum for the Deaf in Hartford, Connecticut, started by Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet and Laurent Clair. Remember, Laurent Clair was deaf, and this school used sign language. The schools that followed, including Texas School for the Deaf, also used this same model. They had a teacher, Emily Lewis, who was one of their earliest students, who then became a teacher, just like Laurent Clair became a teacher at the school that he grew up in. So that was the tradition in the beginning. Most schools used sign language and had deaf and hearing teachers working there. So remember, for many years, a deaf child was either sent away to a state boarding school, or they had to just succeed in public school with no extra help, or just forgo education altogether. Outside of that state school, there was little or no access to sign language. Unless you knew somebody who knew how to sign, it was very difficult to learn. We talked about Alexander Graham Bell, and even though he's famous for inventing the telephone, and that's what history remembers him for, but if asked, he would have told you he was an educator of the deaf. You can see him there sitting in the middle of that picture with his students outside of Boston. And he taught deaf students for many years. And part of inventing the telephone was about trying to amplify sound so deaf children could hear. And beginning in 1880 and fostered by the work of Alexander Graham Bell, many schools switched to oralism in an effort to eradicate deafness. Remember, this photo, this drawing down here at the bottom is of the Milan Conference in 1880, where it was announced by this group of so-called professionals that all schools would switch to oralism. Now, even their own notes betrayed them. Edward Minor Gallaudet shared this with us. Even their own notes betrayed them. If you look closely at the minutes of the meeting, where they said, well, if your kid can be taught with oralism, they should be, but there's other kids who are going to have to use sign language because they're never going to be successful at oral students. So you can go ahead and use sign language with them if you have to. And so, like he says, to think that the utterances, that anything that they had to say would be representing the sentiments of deaf teachers throughout the world is like saying that everybody's going to vote the way the Republicans are going to vote, or the Democrats, like going to a political party and thinking that group is going to represent everybody. They stack the deck, and he wanted to make sure people knew that when he wrote his notes afterward. So we switched to oralism, no more sign language. So it was almost as if ASL was taken out back and executed for not fitting not fitting their expectations. Now, so that meant a lot of schools developed these zero tolerance policies towards signing, or like I said, they only used it as a last resort if nothing else worked, but it was considered kind of dirty and ugly, and kids had to teach each other in secret, or they because the deaf community still continued to use it though. So a lot of times after kids got out of school, they'd learn to sign from other deaf people, or families that had hereditary deafness in it, kids would learn it. And a lot of religious organizations embraced it as a clear form of communication. They didn't care about these rules of what was going on in schools. They just wanted to communicate with their parishioners and help those in need. So there were places, so ASL managed to kind of hobble along and survive during this time, even though schools weren't allowed to use it. So we left off in this kind of dark ages, right? The Milan Conference, 1880. Now we're going to skip ahead to 1962. That's 80 years after the Milan Conference, and there is not a lot that has changed in deaf education. Like I said, most schools are oral, most kids are focused on speech, and sign language is like the last ditch effort, the last possibility to educate these kids. But 1962, when things started to change, there was a pandemic that spread across the US and Europe called rubella. It's also known as the German measles, and it is a virus that causes flu-like symptoms. Might sound a little familiar to you. For the most part, rubella isn't that bad of an illness. Most people, like I said, they feel sick for a couple days. There were some severe cases and stuff, but for the most part, it wasn't that horrible disease. However, If a woman was pregnant, especially early on in her pregnancy, and she got rubella, it could cause some serious birth defects. And it could cause infant death, it could cause blindness, and it could cause deafness. So during that time, 12,000 children were born deaf in the US during those 3 years while the German measles passed through. That is a huge increase in the number of deaf children that were coming into schools. The book Deaf Like Me is a memoir written by a family who went through this. And we're going to watch a film based on this book later, probably next week. But this talks about Lynn, the wife, doesn't even really notice she's sick. Now, her oldest son gets sick, and he stays home a couple days from school, and she takes care of him. She never really noticed being ill at all, and she didn't know she was pregnant yet. But then 9 months later, when their daughter is born, sure enough, she is deaf. And so Deaf Like Me is just their journey through this experience. So it's an excellent book. So if you're looking for a good read, I would highly recommend Deaf Like Me by Thomas and James Bradley. All right, so now suddenly there's all of these deaf children that need to be educated. Like, boom, we went from just a handful of kids to now hundreds of kids that need a place to go to school. And so families are turning to, okay, how do I educate my deaf child? And they'd go to visit deaf schools. And in 1817, when the American School for the Deaf was founded, boarding school was a common option. Lots of students were educated that way. But by 1962 or 1965, they feel it about the same way you and I do. That's only for like extreme cases and stuff like that. Most kids at that point were educated in their own neighborhood. And boarding school was a kind of a strange concept, especially the idea of sending a preschooler to go to boarding school. If anybody went to boarding school, it was usually when they were older, middle school or high school. And the idea of sending a 3-year-old was just crazy. If you look at the picture down there in the corner, that's the Fenwood School for the Deaf. And it was set up like a military academy. So very strict rules. The kids wore uniforms. They marched to all their classes. And, if that's not how you wanted your child educated, you were kind of out of luck, because that was the deaf school in that area. So these families needed somewhere to educate their children, and they'd go to visit the state schools, and the state school said, we don't have room for this many kids. We're used to having 6 kids in a kindergarten class, and now you're talking about 30. We're not built for that. We don't have the classroom space. We don't have the teachers. We don't have these resources. Then the parents are coming to visit these schools, and they're looking at it, and they see schools that are underfunded, that are dismal. Some of these schools are now 150, 100 years old. The buildings are old. They're falling apart. There hasn't been a lot of funding. This hasn't been a priority to anybody. And they're looking at these schools and like, I'm not sending my 3-year-old to go live here. No way. And so the solution was to create the regional day school programs for the deaf. Now, let me tell you a little about how this worked. I'm going to read you a little bit from an article in a newspaper called the Norwalk Hour. Norwalk was a city, still is a city in Connecticut, and this article is from November 17th, 1966. And I'm just going to read you a few parts of it. The Connecticut Association for Hearing Impaired Children has received assurance from state officials for state support of legislation to provide day school programs through the state of Connecticut for such children. Day school meaning they just go for the day and then go home. Richland would count as a day school because you just go there for the day and then you go back to stay with your family. The state now helps to support the 2 schools for the deaf in Mystic and West Hartford. The school in West Hartford would be the American School for the Deaf. But the association points out that these are residential schools, and there is a need for day schools to allow the hearing impaired child to live at home with his family. The association has established that there are several hundred hearing impaired children throughout the state as a result of the German measles epidemic of 1964. So here was what they were going to provide. There were 4 things that they were going to provide now through these day school programs. 1, provide day classes for preschool hearing impaired children at about 2 years of age on a regional basis using existing facilities where feasible, meaning within regular public schools. Number 2, provide education for school-age children under the auspices of local boards of education. So that means the local school board is making decisions instead of the board that runs the state school. Number 3, provide for those who do not benefit by the above by enlarging existing schools for the deaf and building new regional day schools if there is a need. So they were also going to send more funding to the state schools so that those kids who needed to go there still had that option. And number 4, provide transportation, teachers of the deaf, physical space, and a coordinator of day school programs for the hearing impaired child. That means make sure that there were people and facilities that could accommodate deaf children and knew how to work with them, instead of just saying to a regular elementary teacher, oh, you get to work with deaf kids now, congrats. They had teachers that were actually, well, they were starting to train teachers to work with deaf students and know the special ways to help kids learn visually. And to finish up the article, the need is now more than ever for these, since the 2 schools for the deaf are already faced with a long waiting list for the coming school year due to the hearing impaired children born during the rubella epidemic. All right, so this was the start of regional day school programs. And that meant that deaf children could live at home with their families. We are not sending, like Emily Lewis talked about, sending a kid to school and then them not coming back for 2 or 3 years. We're done with that at this point. Families aren't going to put up with that. So now kids could live at home with their families and come home on the bus every day. And they would receive a higher quality education than they would at the state school, because the local school board is in charge of that, and therefore parents have more say in what goes on. A lot of times at those state schools, people didn't bother to care how well those kids were being educated, or they focused on trade skills, like teaching them a trade, like how to run a printing press or how to make shoes. But they weren't preparing kids for college. They were just preparing them for some kind of job, and usually kind of a menial job. So this way they could get a better quality education. These deaf students were educated in self-contained classrooms within a larger public school in their city. So they're probably they might go to the same campus as their siblings, or at least, maybe not to the same campus, but at least one close by, so they could still come home every day. And that way they could have those resources. They could have teachers who knew sign language, teachers who knew how to teach visually, teachers who could recognize the limitations of their learning because they were deaf, but within the local school. Birdville ISD has a regional day school program. So does Fort Worth, so does Arlington. Plenty of other districts in the area do not. So that's just something to think about. That means all the deaf students in Birdville ISD all get sent to the same elementary school. So it might not be where their brothers and sisters go, but at least they're not riding 3 hours on the bus to get to school, right? It's not like they're going to Austin. They're just going to Snow Heights instead of to General Cheney, right? They're just going to a different school in their same neighborhood, in their same district. All the deaf high school kids in Birdville go to Birdville High. So even if they lived in the Richland district, they just ride the bus a little further and go to Birdville, because they have deaf ed teachers there, they have interpreters there, they have all those services ready for them at school. Now, let's take a little bit to talk about American Sign Language. It began in 1817 with the establishment of the American School for the Deaf. And we talked about how it was Laurent Clerc's French Sign Language, De La Pie's methodical signs, signs from Martha's Vineyard, and new signs that they developed along the way that all kind of blended together to start ASL. But it did not gain recognition as an actual bona fide language until a man named William Stokey published his dictionary in 1965. That's his picture there on the right and a copy of the dictionary. Stokey did not publish his dictionary in like alphabetical order. There were dictionaries before that where somebody would draw a picture of the sign or write out a description of what the sign looked like. His was a little different. He organized it by hand shape, movement, and location on the body. Does that sound familiar? Because William Stokey was the one who first recognized the parameters of a sign. They later added, he later added palm orientation, and then after that they added non-manual signals to recognize it took all 5 of those to work together. But it was Stokey's work in categorizing signs that way that helped it gain recognition by linguists as a bona fide language. So we have the rubella epidemic in 1962 through 1964. Then in 1965, Stokey published his dictionary. And about that same time, 1964, the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf was established. And their goal was to advocate for excellence in interpreting. And they set up standards to protect interpreters and their clients, both deaf and hearing. Before the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, there was no testing for interpreters. There was no oversight to see, are you qualified? Are you going to keep this information confidential? Are you respected in the community, and do you have the skills to do this work? Before that, there was no oversight at all. So when you hired, if you could find an interpreter to hire, you didn't know what kind of skills they had. But RID set to fix that and said, no, we need to make sure that there are quality interpreters. And it kind of invented interpreting as a profession. It didn't really exist before that happened. So all of these things are kind of happening at the same time to create, to kind of bring ASL back into the spotlight. Now we're going to skip ahead a little bit to 1977. And at this point, Congress passes Public Law 94-142. And I know that's a really sexy title. So the other name for it was IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And this law was written to assure that all children, regardless of their disability, have access to a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. I don't know if there's that scene in Forrest Gump. I don't know if you remember it, where the Forrest's mom goes to see the principal and says, you know, I want my son to come to school here. And he says, no, he can't come to school here because his IQ needs to be at this number and he's lower than that. And therefore we can't help you, right? Before this law came to pass, schools could say, I'm sorry, your kid can't come to school here because they're in a wheelchair, because they can't read very well, because they have what other disability they have. We can't accommodate them. You're going to have to find another place to go to school for them. Even Thomas Edison was sent home from school because the teacher said, he doesn't pay attention, so I can't teach him. Well, the kid just had ADHD. But after that, his mother homeschooled him. But, you know, the teacher could just say, no, I can't deal with this. I'm not going to educate you anymore. At this point, this law made that illegal and said, no, every child has the right to a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. Now we're going to kind of go through that and talk about specifically what that means. Free means they don't have to pay extra just because they need special services. That means there is this law included federal funding to help pay for any of those special services that they need. So to make sure that schools were retrofitted with ramps and elevators so that kids had access to it. If they needed they needed a deaf education teacher, that's a specialized field, but you can't charge those families and say, oh, you need special services? Well, cough up some more money. This helped pay for that. It says a free and appropriate education. That means students are assessed and placed where they can be challenged and yet successful. We're not just going to stick them in some classroom at the end of the hall and let them watch cartoons all day. Okay. This said, you need to figure out what the student's capable of and challenge them, make sure that they're learning things, and yet not so overwhelm them that they can't learn. And that's why we have modifications. That's why we have accommodations and stuff for students in order to make regular classrooms appropriate to them. And speaking of, the last part says this needs to happen in the least restrictive environment, which means as much as possible, disabled children, and it's regardless of their disability, whether that's cognition problems, if that's being in a wheelchair, if that's being deaf, blind, whatever, disabled children are to be educated with their non-disabled peers. These kids have the right to as much regular ed exposure as possible, that they have as much as we can, everything else that other kids get. Now, some kids aren't going to be successful with you in your class, right? They can't, online is going to be too difficult for them. So maybe we send them to an inclusion class. Maybe we send them to, a different level of classes, but they might still be with you in your PE class. They might still be with you in your art class. There are still ways that they might still eat lunch with you. There are still places where they can have access to regular education, even if it's not in an academic subject. This definition of least restrictive environment introduced the concept of mainstreaming. So that means, like I said, as much as possible, disabled kids are in regular education classes. So some students, because of their past educational experience or because of the severity of their disability, cannot function in a regular education classroom, right? That these kids, even with modifications, they're not going to be able to do the work that everybody else does. And so that's part of what that assessment is about. Just to give you an example, let me tell you about some of my former students. We're going to compare two boys, Jaime and Mike. Jaime was born in Mexico, and it took a little while for his parents to figure out that he was deaf. He had never been to school, and his family only used home signs. Then they moved to the U.S. when he was about 7, but they were still speaking Spanish at home, and he saw English and ASL only at school. Now we're going to compare him with Mike. Mike lost his hearing due to an illness when he was about 8 months old, and his mom, who was a registered nurse, figured it out immediately. Both his parents started learning sign language very soon after, and his mom learned everything she could about deaf education and deaf culture. She met with his teachers often and helped him with his homework every night. Now, if these boys are the same age, are they going to have the same educational level when they're freshmen? No, because they come from different educational experiences. Mike could learn the same information at the same rate as hearing kids his age. He just needed to learn it in ASL. Jaime struggled to understand even simple concepts and sentences. Think about kids and all the questions they ask their parents, right? Why is the sky blue? Why does this happen? What is that? No one had ever answered Jaime's questions like that. Mike could pass your biology class just fine as long as he had an interpreter. Jaime, on the other hand, wouldn't understand the lecture, even if it was interpreted in ASL, wouldn't be able to comprehend the book, even if he tried to read it, and he wouldn't be able to process the concepts being taught. He wouldn't have the higher order thinking skills to answer the test questions. The limitations go on and on. So a group of education people, teachers, diagnosticians, administrators, parents, sometimes the students themselves, would have an ARD meeting. ARD stands for Admission, Review, and Dismissal. Would have an ARD meeting to discuss what's best for each of these kids. They'd probably send Jaime into a deaf education classroom where the teacher knows sign language, can simplify the content so he's challenged without being overwhelmed, and can give him more individual instruction because she has a small class. Mike would be bored in a deaf education like that, in a deaf education class like that. So the committee would probably mainstream him so he could learn everything just like hearing kids. So that's what least restrictive environment would mean for him. Do you think just giving Mike an interpreter is going to be enough for him to succeed in your classes? Some of you in here get frustrated when you're trying to write down vocabulary and I keep going and you can't watch me and write at the same time. Imagine doing that in every class all day. So there are several different levels of intervention and various services that schools can provide for students with disabilities to be successful. So that means many students with disabilities can be successful if they have the right support. So we talked about self-contained classrooms. Some kids, maybe they do fine in classes like health and computers and stuff like that, but they struggle with reading and math. Okay, so they might be in reading and math self-contained classrooms for those. They might have itinerant teachers. That means that these kids, itinerant teachers are for kids who are mainstreamed most of the day, but maybe twice a week, a teacher trained in deaf education comes to their school, pulls them out of like an elective, like music class or PE or something, and sits down with them and says, okay, how are you doing in classes? Where are you struggling? What are you looking at? And kind of gives them basically often one-on-one tutoring to help them get caught up to help them keep up with school and give them extra help. They might have inclusion classes or content mastery. Content mastery we used to have here at Richland, and they've kind of changed the way special ed works around here anymore. But that was the idea of that was a classroom you could go to and get, again, one-on-one tutorial help with specific homework assignments if you needed it. They might have interpreters. We talked about Mike in your biology class, right? So the teacher would be there teaching away, Mike would be there, and then there'd also be an interpreter to sign everything that was going on in the classroom. They might have assistive listening devices. This is like amplification. So sometimes there's a box that students can carry around that the school would kind of check out to them. And the box comes with a lapel mic that the teacher can clip onto his shirt. And then as he talks, the students got that speaker where they can listen, or that device plugs in directly to their cochlear implant or to their hearing aids, so that they are only hearing the teacher's voice and not hearing the kids next to them talking and paper shuffling around and all those other noises that we learn to tune out. Get very distracting for deaf students, and it's harder to filter out all of those noises. So assistive listening devices can help them just focus on what they need to hear. They might have note takers. Usually in high school, teachers will just give the students a copy of the notes. But sometimes in college levels, they'll actually pay a student who's got good grades and comes to school every day and all that kind of stuff, pay that student to take notes for the deaf student. So these days, deaf students and their parents have a choice in how they're educated. They can still go to the state school and learn ASL and be there with other deaf kids who are just like them and function in that little deaf world. They can go to an oral school and learn how to speak. Even here at Birdville, parents in the preschool program have a choice. They can send their kids to an oral preschool program where they focus on speech and listening, or they can send them to a deaf ed classroom that focuses on signing. So you can even choose that here in the local district. They can attend deaf classes at their local school, and they can be mainstream with the proper services like interpreters. Now, these days, the debate between oralism and manualism still rages on, right? What is best for deaf students? Many deaf students still experience language deprivation. That means literally they are deprived of language, where a parent says, oh, I want my kid to be quote unquote normal. I want them to have every experience everybody else does. So yes, let's go with oralism. And they send their kid to an oral program, and maybe some kids do fine. Some kids do well with that, and other kids struggle and don't have the language skills that they need. So there's a group called there's a movement called LEAD-K, and it's an acronym. I can't remember exactly what it stands for. But they are working to ensure that deaf students have access to English and ASL and are prepared to start school. Niall DeMarco, who's pictured there on the right, is a big advocate for this. Niall DeMarco became famous because he won America's Next Top Model, and then the very next year won Dancing with the Stars. Not just participated in Dancing with the Stars, he won the whole thing. He is a graduate of Gallaudet University. He studied math there and was originally planning to become a teacher, and now he's like a model and an actor. But the point of LEAD-K here is that if a student is in an oral program and they're not being successful, the school district can, or the state can step in and say, hey, we need to get this kid into a signing classroom and make sure that kids have the language that they need to be successful. And they can't let parents just hold out hope that, well, maybe we'll try this oralism thing longer and they'll catch up, because they never do, or they rarely do. And once the kid gets behind in language, they never really get caught up. So LEAD-K is an effort to make sure no kid gets left behind and that everybody has the language skills they need. We're going to end things right here. I hope you've learned a lot and have a new perspective on deaf education in America. Happy signing.